They said silence proves weakness, but silence is the sharpest blade. My dad erased my rank in front of generals, treating me like I was worthless. That humiliation cut deeper than steel. But brutal revenge doesn't roar. Silent revenge waits, gathers proof, and strikes when no one expects it. Today, the legacy he tried to bury rises in fire. My name is Captain Elena Ward. I'm 37 years old, a military intelligence officer, trained to dissect conversations, decode silences, and catch the one sound in a room full of noise that means danger. My job is to be invisible. But that day, invisibility wasn't a strategy. It was a sentence. The hall was heavy with ceremony. Marble floors gleamed under polished boots. Flags hung like judgment from every wall. Generals filled the front rows, their medals winking in the light, their eyes sharp as blades. My father, General Marcus Ward, commanded the room the way he always did, shoulders squared, chin raised, voice tuned to authority. And then he cut me down with a single line. "This is my daughter, Captain Ward. She's here to help with notes, nothing more." He said it loud enough for every man in uniform to hear, loud enough to strip every stripe from my sleeve without ever touching it. A ripple of amusement passed through the room. Smirks, whispers, one stifled laugh that carried sharper than gunfire. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, but my face stayed still, carved in stone. I've lived too long in the shadows to give them the satisfaction of a flinch. That's the cruelty of humiliation. It doesn't roar. It slides under your skin. Patient, deliberate, unforgettable. My own father erased me in front of the men who measured worth in scars and ribbons, who now saw me as a secretary in uniform. He called me junior, disposable, background noise. But here's the mistake they made. Background noise carries signals no one else hears. In my hands, pressed tight against my chest, lay a folder. Not paper, not ink. Proof. Proof that could set the entire hall on fire without a single match. While my father was busy polishing his legacy, I was holding the weapon that would end it. Humiliation doesn't break me, it sharpens me. Every laugh, every dismissive glance, every slight glance of pity. They didn't crush me. They cloaked me. They turned me invisible, and invisible is where revenge is born. I didn't correct him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for the truth. I smiled, a thin, dangerous smile, and took my seat. My silence was the first move. Silence is where strategy hides. And when the moment came, I would no longer be erased. I would own the board. Welcome to hidden vengeance. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or stripped of what you've earned, you'll understand why I stayed quiet and why I struck when it mattered. Make sure you like, subscribe, and stay with me, because this isn't just a story of betrayal. This is a story of brutal revenge, of taking back what was stolen, and of exposing a legacy built on lies. They thought I was powerless. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought wrong. And when the pen hovered over that historic document, when the world leaned in to watch history being written, none of them knew I was about to flip the page. Because the signature hadn't touched the paper yet, and already the first crack had begun. The generals saw a daughter dismissed, a captain erased. But what they couldn't see was the file in my hands, and how one revelation inside it would tear open everything they thought untouchable. After the laughter in that hall faded, the silence followed me everywhere. It lingered in the scrape of boots against marble, in the clipped nods from officers who no longer looked me in the eye. They didn't need to say it. Their glances spoke enough. To them, I was just the general's daughter, useful for clerical duties, a shadow with no real weight. And my father never corrected them. He let the lie live, even when he knew what I was capable of. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't need to shout. It thrives in the quiet omissions, the spaces where someone should have stood up for you and chose not to. I'd spent years earning my clearance, staying up through nights most soldiers slept through, combing through intercepted calls and fractured transmissions, piecing together whispers until they formed something sharp enough to cut. Yet all of that collapsed in a single moment when he stripped my rank with a careless introduction. I carried the insult with me back to the secure wing, and as I closed the door to the analysis bay, I felt the sting harden into something colder. Revenge isn't rage, it's patience. And patience demands evidence. I buried myself in files others had overlooked. Numbers stacked neatly on requisition forms, but their rhythm was off. Too perfect. Too clean. A cipher lived in the spaces, in the deliberate symmetry of digits. Then came the faint crackle of a radio intercept. A voice, clipped, calculated with a European edge, murmured, "The seal is the bullet." It was a phrase most analysts would dismiss as noise, but not me. Words are never wasted. They're weapons, if you know how to use them. And then there was the footage. Not the staged ceremony reels, not the polished official angles, but the raw hallway feed at 0600 hours. Colonel Harlan, my father's most trusted deputy, slipping past a security checkpoint with a badge that bore my father's signature. A quiet act, invisible to most. But to me, it was as loud as gunfire. Suspicion isn't evidence. That mantra drilled into me at the academy kept me from running straight into the command center, shouting accusations. I knew better. If I moved too soon, I'd look reckless, emotional. Exactly what they expected from someone, just an aide. So I stayed still. I logged the footage. I compared signatures. I filed timestamps like beads on a wire, threading them into a pattern no one else had the patience to see. At night, when the corridors emptied and the lights hummed low, I studied every discrepancy until my vision blurred. I leaned close to the monitor, fingers tracing over ink that wasn't quite right, listening to static that wasn't quite random. Every detail fed the storm I carried inside. And yet, in the mess of evidence and fragments, my father's shadow loomed. Was he blind or was he complicit? Did he fail to see or did he choose not to look? The deeper I went, the sharper the edge became. Betrayal didn't live only in the colonel sneaking through doors or the voice murmuring about bullets disguised as seals. It lived in my father's silence. It lived in every moment he dismissed me, every chance he had to see me as more than a daughter holding folders. If you've ever been erased, if you've ever felt the weight of being underestimated while knowing you carried the truth in your hands, you know this ache. That's why I need you to share this story, because too many of us have been silenced in rooms where we should have been heard. Spread it. Let others see what it means when patience and proof finally collide. I thought the worst wound was being dismissed in front of the generals. But that wasn't the deepest cut. The real scar was forming quietly, in the shadows of those files, where evidence piled higher and the question I didn't want to ask pressed harder against me. If my father wasn't blind, then whose side was he really on? Proof doesn't scream when it first appears. It whispers. It hides in corners where no one bothers to look. I found mine buried in a stack of clearances, each page stamped, signed, filed away like routine housekeeping. But routines are where mistakes live, and mistakes are where truth bleeds out. One line caught me, Colonel Harlan's access request. Not through the main gate, not with the escort he should have had, but a one-off clearance stamped with my father's signature. The date aligned too perfectly, 2 minutes before a restricted item entered the hall. I traced the ink with my fingertip, almost expecting it to smudge, to vanish, to free me from what I already knew. It didn't. The paper burned under my skin, steady and undeniable. I pushed deeper. The hallway footage flickered grainy on the screen, a shadowed figure swiping a badge that glinted once under the light. Not a guard. not a staff officer. Harlan, his shoulders hunched just enough to betray knowledge of his trespass. The lock yielded, a green light blooming like an omen, and the door eased open. A moment later, the feed skipped. Interference spliced neatly across the seconds where the pen was placed. Too clean to be chance. Too calculated to be ignored. The deeper I dug, the heavier the silence around me grew. Files stacked high, screens replaying the same loops, my notes spread across the desk like a crime scene only I could see. I felt the air tighten, as if the walls themselves understood the danger of what I was uncovering. Proof changes everything. Proof doesn't let you pretend anymore. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion pressing into my bones. But I couldn't stop. Every thread I pulled led back to the same point. My father's signature. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was blindness. Maybe it was something darker. I wanted to believe he didn't know. But belief isn't evidence. And evidence was all I had. That's when the ache shifted into resolve. My silence had given me cover. My patience had given me time. And now, the proof gave me a blade sharper than any weapon in that hall. Revenge wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was a strategy written in ink, preserved on tape, waiting for the right moment to surface. If you've ever carried proof no one wanted to see, if you've ever known something so dangerous it kept you awake at night, then you understand why I kept going. And that's why I want you to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Vengeance, because stories like this remind us that silence is never weakness when it carries truth inside it. I gathered the documents into a folder, slid the footage onto a drive, each movement precise, deliberate. My hands didn't shake, but my chest carried the weight of every choice I was about to make. To expose him was to risk everything. My rank, my clearance, my family. To stay silent was to let betrayal grow until it swallowed us all. The desk lamp buzzed softly, casting shadows across the pages, and I realized something I hadn't dared admit. The pen wasn't the weapon. The badge wasn't the weapon. The real weapon was trust, and trust had already been detonated. I closed the folder, locked the drive, and stood. My father's world, my father's legacy, teetered on the edge of collapse. And I was the one holding the match. But the next step wasn't about evidence. It was about timing. About the moment when silence would break, and every eye in that room would finally see who I really was, and who he had chosen to trust instead. The hearing chamber was colder than I expected, though not because of the air. It was the kind of cold that came from eyes watching, waiting, judging. Rows of officers sat in silence, the weight of their medals glinting under fluorescent light. My father stood at the center of it all, posture rigid, his jaw locked in the same formation I had grown up with. For a moment, he looked like the man I had saluted as a child, but when the folder in my hand touched the table, that image cracked. I slid the evidence across the polished surface, the sound sharp enough to cut through the stillness. A drive, a stack of papers, timestamps. My father's signature gleamed on the clearance log, too neat, too undeniable. The footage played on the screen, Harlan slipping past the scanner with a badge no one should have had. Gasps rippled across the room like a wind snapping through flags. My father's face didn't flinch, but his fingers twitched against his side, just once, like a man realizing the gun he carried was never loaded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I read the log aloud, slow, deliberate, every syllable echoing. The signature was his. The access was his. And the consequence, almost his legacy. Silence pressed tighter against the walls until you could hear the scrape of a pen from someone in the back row taking notes. My father's eyes found mine across the table. No anger, just something heavier, something close to recognition. The colonel overseeing the hearing turned to him, voice clipped. Do you deny this authorization? The question landed like a strike. My father inhaled, his chest rising against the weight of it. For a heartbeat, I thought he might lie. I thought he might reach for the shield of rank, of years served, of campaigns survived. But he didn't. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them and said words I had never heard him speak in a room like this. I signed it. No excuses, no attempt to drag me down with him. Just an admission. But admission wasn't the end. It was only the crack. And I was the one holding the wedge. I leaned forward, voice steady, sharper than any blade. You signed it because you trusted the wrong man. And that trust almost destroyed everything you swore to protect. His shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in the way stone finally shifts under too much weight. The room shifted with him. What had been suspicion turned into something else. Uneasy respect for the fact that he had spoken the truth, even as it gutted him. But the true reversal wasn't his confession. It was mine. For the first time in my life, the generals didn't see me as a shadow standing behind him. They saw me as the one who had caught what he missed, the one who had prevented a disaster. Their eyes lingered on me now, not with dismissal, but with calculation. And calculation is the first step toward recognition. I stood straighter, not because I needed their approval, but because I understood what had just happened. The legacy my father thought he owned was already slipping into my hands, not through inheritance, not through favor, but through proof. He had erased my rank in front of them once. Now, without saying a word, they were giving it back. But proof isn't enough on its own. Proof needs weight, needs exposure, needs the moment when silence finally becomes undeniable. That moment was mine to claim. And as the hearing closed, I knew the game had shifted. Because the next move wasn't about what I had shown in that chamber. It was about what I had yet to reveal. Evidence sharp enough to not only expose betrayal, but to carve out the future that should have been mine all along. The chamber's silence followed me out, heavier than any verdict. Proof was no longer hidden. It was alive, breathing fire beneath their polished uniforms. They thought exposure was the end. I knew better. The real reckoning waited outside, where reputation, power, and legacy would finally face justice in the open. The day of reckoning didn't arrive with sirens or gunfire. It arrived with the steady rhythm of boots on concrete, a sound that echoed through the courtyard outside headquarters like a slow drumbeat. Crowds gathered, officers, aides, even civilians who'd heard whispers of what had been uncovered. Their eyes weren't on me at first. They were on my father, standing rigid in full dress uniform, shoulders squared but weighted down by the silence pressing against him. For once, medals on his chest didn't gleam with pride. They looked heavy, almost accusatory, like relics of a man who hadn't seen the shift in front of him until it was too late. The panel began without theatrics. No gavel, no speeches. Just facts laid bare, projected onto screens for everyone to see. Clearance logs, security footage, the pen that had almost turned into a legacy of blood instead of ink. Each piece fell into place like stones on a grave, building something too solid to be ignored. The truth wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, and the silence that followed every revelation was sharper than applause. I didn't speak right away. I waited. That's what strategy demands. Timing. Let them watch the footage again. Let the evidence breathe. Let the sting settle into their bones until they realized the danger hadn't been avoided by rank or command, but by the very person they had dismissed. When my moment came, I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid the final document on the table, my hand steady, my gaze locked on the council. This is what saved you, I said. Not luck, not protocol. Observation. Silence. The words landed like a blade drawn clean. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. His silence was no longer authority, it was concession. And in that stillness, the power shifted. The generals looked past him, their attention fixed squarely on me. Not as his daughter, not as a junior aide, but as the one who had held the line when everything else had cracked. It wasn't triumph I felt in that moment. Triumph is noisy. This was different. Calmer, deeper, more cutting. It was the kind of victory that doesn't need celebration because it leaves no doubt. My father's legacy had been built in campaigns and battlefields, but mine was carved in silence, in the spaces between words, in the proof that couldn't be erased. When the session ended, he walked out beside me. His step was slower than mine, his shadow shorter than I remembered. He didn't speak until the crowd had thinned, and even then his words weren't sharp. They were quiet, almost fragile. "You've taken back what I erased." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me he finally understood what silence could build and what arrogance could destroy. That night, I didn't celebrate with champagne or toasts. I sat alone in my quarters, a single lamp burning, the folder of evidence sealed and stored. Outside, the flag rippled. Under floodlights, steady against the wind. I thought of every moment I had been overlooked, every time my voice had been dismissed, every rank stripped in silence. And I realized none of it mattered anymore, because I had reclaimed more than a title. I had reclaimed power. Justice didn't roar, it whispered, and in that whisper, everyone heard it. My victory wasn't just in proving them wrong, it was in proving myself undeniable. The legacy no longer belonged to the man who tried to erase me, it belonged to the woman who refused to disappear. When it was over, I stepped outside into the night. The air was sharp, alive with the kind of silence that follows after a storm has torn through and left everything standing, but changed. The flag above the base stirred against the wind, not with triumph, but with endurance. And I knew it mirrored me. I hadn't shouted my way into justice. I hadn't begged or pleaded. I had waited, observed, and struck when proof was undeniable. That's what silence can do. It doesn't mean weakness. It means patience sharpened into a blade. If there's one lesson I carry from all of this, it's simple. Preparation matters more than pride. The loudest person in the room rarely holds the power. It's the one who listens, the one who notices what others dismiss, the one who refuses to vanish even when underestimated. That's where the real advantage lies. So I ask you, have you ever held back your words? Not because you couldn't fight, but because you knew silence itself was the stronger weapon? I'll keep telling these stories, not to glorify revenge, but to show what discipline, silence, and strategy can build when the world expects you to break. If you felt even a spark of recognition in my story, subscribe and stay with me here. There are more truths to uncover, more reckonings to face, and more victories carved quietly in the dark before they ever shine in the light. Thank you for giving your time to my story, told with honesty. Thank you for noticing what others overlook. The truth survives because you chose to see it.